In this video, I'll show you how to assemble the shaft support assembly. So we'll start a new assembly, standard inch IAM, create, and I'm going to just have my one screen up here. Alright, so now whenever you start, you always want to start with a kind of a main component of the assembly. Don't start with something small like the screw, for example. You always want to start with, in this case, we'd start with the base plate. Let's zoom out a little bit, and that's fine. So you left click, right click, and say OK. Alright, so there's my base plate. And then I'm going to add parts to that in an order that makes sense. So the next part that I think I would add would be the bearing that sits on top of those, on that. So place the bearing. Now before you say OK, try to orient this piece so that it's close to the way it's going to be when it's constrained here. So take a look at your axes. The red axis is the X. If I spin it around the X, I can get the bottom surface the way that I want. So right click and say rotate X 90. Go one more time, right click, rotate X 90. That's pretty good. Let's just stick with that. So now I'm going to left click, right click, and say OK. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is constrain the bottom of the bearing to the top of that place, the plate. So let's say constrain and leave all your defaults the way they are. Let's click on the bottom of that. See how, again, I'm getting the whole surface there. Click that. Now it's asking me for the second input. Let me turn this. Second input would be that surface, and it looks good. Say OK. So now what I have is it's constrained to that surface. Now again, because it's a three-dimensional space, it may not look like it, but it is constrained to that surface there. So I need some more constraints. Now whenever you have mounting holes, that's a really good way to constrain something. And what I would do is use the center line. So I have the center line of that counterbore hole and the center line of my threaded hole. So that's going to be my next constraint that I'll put on there. Again, I don't have to change any of these. So move your cursor till you see the center line, not the circles, not the dot. But you need to see the center line. And likewise over here, when you see the center line, and let's say apply. And I'll do the same thing. Let's stop for a second. Let's see what we have so far. So now I have, you see I have it on the surface, and I also have it constrained to the center line of that. So now let's see if we can get that constrained. Same thing. Make sure you see the center line and the center line, and say OK. And now that's fully constrained on there. So that's attached. And you can see the bolt holes line up. Everything looks good so far. Okay, next, why don't we put the screws in there? So let's go to place. Let's put the cap screws in. Now we're going to need two of them, but let's do one at a time. So it looks like if I spin it around the green axis, which is Y, that would put it in the correct orientation. So right click, rotate Y. Oops, got to keep going. Rotate Y. Rotate Y, there we go. So that's the way I want that one. And I'm just going to left click, and then I'll continue because I'm going to add another one. And the orientation is correct, so left pick, right click, and say OK. If you want to keep adding, just click the left button and then add another one. Click the left button, and when you're done, then you want to right click and say OK. So now I want to constrain these again because it's a cylinder and we have a hole. In order to constrain it, use the center line. So center line of that. Center line of there. I will apply that. Now let's turn this, because what I want to do is get the bottom surface. Now don't get that circle. Make sure you get the surface. You see the difference? Like with the surface it'll be outlined on the inside and outside. So there's that surface. That's my first input. And then I want to get down into the bottom of that counterbore and click that surface and say OK. So I got my one screw in. Now if you'll notice, I can still spin this screw, but I don't care about that. If I wanted to stop that, I'd have to put another constraint on there, but I don't really care about that. Okay, let's do the same thing on the second screw here. So constrain, center line, to center line, apply. If you hit apply, then the menu will stay active. If you hit OK, it's going to stop doing what it's doing. Okay, so same thing. surface, bottom surface of the screw and the top surface of that counterbore and say OK. All right, so you can see there's one reason you might want to change your colors on your parts, because when you start to assemble them, sometimes they start to blend together. But that's good enough. I do want to add that the last piece is that collar. And again, pay attention to the orientation. So I got lucky there because that's the correct orientation, because it has to sit on top of there. So left click, right click, and say OK. Now the color is almost the same as that. I'm going to change that color. So let's go open up our collar, and I can just come over here and change it to something. Now don't do something. You can do something weird on there if you want, but be careful, because when you do that, it adds a lot of, the file size gets big, and your computer's going to start to struggle. So there, I change it to like a cast part, just so I can see it. It doesn't affect anything. It's just a visual right now. Okay, so once again, to constrain that, the easiest way to do it is center line to center line, and I'm going to say OK, because see what it did, it actually put it down inside the part, and that happens. The software doesn't understand physics, but we know that it's lined up with the center line. And then all we need to do is get those surfaces mated. So if we constrain that surface to that surface, say OK. Now again, you can turn this collar, but I don't really care. That's not really an issue. All right, so there's my assembly. Now we're going to put that assembly onto a drawing sheet. Let's go ahead and save that. So I'll do a save as, and I'll call that the shaft support assembly. And we're going to make a new drawing. So we'll do File New, go to ANSI Inch Drawing, Create. Not going to use a D size, right? So let's change that. I think we can probably put on a B size comfortably. Now on an assembly drawing, you don't want to put orthographic views. You want to put one or maybe two isometric views, depending on the complexity of the object. So let's try to just do it with one isometric view. So let's go base view. Let's make sure we have the right thing, because we got a lot of stuff open. Make sure we do have the shaft support assembly. And now let's come over here. I don't want an ortho view. I did all this work to create 3D models. I don't want an ortho view, but I want an ISO. So just come over here and click on this little arrow to the right of this cube, lower right hand corner, and click on custom orientation. And now what I can do is I can get this oriented exactly the way I want to see it on the screen. Now a couple things you're trying to do. You're letting a person looking at this drawing seeing how the parts fit together. And also you want to be able to label each of these pieces. So I want to see as many pieces as I possibly can. So that's a pretty good view. So let's finish that. I'm going to change the scale. Let's see what full scale looks like. So try to make it nice and big. Don't get carried away. We don't need to put dimensions on here. So that's perfectly acceptable. Now, one thing sometimes you want to do is change the appearance and do this shaded view. Just beware, like if you go to print that, it's going to take a lot of ink on the printer, but it does make a much nicer appearance. Don't shade in your details, because that's not necessary. Okay, so the other thing we're going to do here with annotation is we're going to put balloons on each of these parts, and we're going to add a parts list. So go up to balloon, click on your first part. This menu is going to pop up, and just say OK, and OK again. And then put your balloon where you want it. Again, not on the part and not in some awkward position. Click, right click, continue. Go to your next part, click, move it out to where you want it. Click, right click, continue. And what you're trying to do is make this easy to understand. So if I do the screw, don't do something like this. Don't make it awkward. Pull it out here into an open space. It makes it really easy to see where the arrows are going, because it is hard to see sometimes when you zoom out. So that looks pretty good. I only have 4 pieces, so that's pretty easy. And lastly, I'm going to add a parts list. So parts list, click inside the red box here and say OK. It's going to create a parts list. Now parts list goes right here. Doesn't go down here, up here. Goes right there, right above. Attach it to the top of your title block. Now I didn't save these when I was making these files. I did not save them as a part number. That's what shows up in here is the number that you saved your drawing under. So I should have added a number to there. I didn't, so that should say numbers. That's a little bit confusing. So make sure you put part numbers on yours. As far as description goes, then if you double click in here, you can just type in here, and this is going to be kind of redundant, but on yours I want you to have drawing numbers in the column that says numbers. And you just hit enter to go to the next line. And then say OK, and that'll fill that out. Parts list shouldn't have empty spaces on there. And then of course fill out your title block. And this one's going to be chef support assembly. And then you can put your name up here. And there's your finished assembly drawing.